The Russian Revolution, Civil War, and its spillover is one of the most complex events in somewhat recent history. While the Reds and Whites fought over the carcass of the Russian Empire, many of her long subjugated minority peoples in the hinterlands of Muscovite domination took the opportunity to jump ship and try their hand at establishing states to call their own. We've already discussed this in detail with Poland, but equally interesting is the case of her next-door neighbor, Ukraine. Ukraine was, in many ways, the beating heart of the Russian Empire. Whoever sought to control its corpse needed to control Ukraine. This, naturally, resulted in the lands changing hands many times, including multiple unique attempts at establishing a truly free Ukraine that could carve her own path in the world. One such attempt was rather unique, with one of the biggest factors at play being the man chosen to lead it. But, of course, this story doesn't start in 1918. Like many stories that involve Ukraine, this one begins with the Cossacks. And I got to hear in my script before I realized that, despite bringing up the Cossacks in every single previous video involving the Russian Civil War, I never fucking bothered to explain who they actually are. Might be. So, this history lesson begins with a completely different history lesson that I promise is actually relevant. Because the Cossacks are intrinsically tied to the history of both Ukraine and Russia, and I also think that they are incredibly interesting, so we're going to talk about them to contextualize a few things in this video and a bunch of other ones. Now, the Cossacks are a neat little group. Put simply, they were a sort of military and aristocratic class that emerged in the lands formerly occupied by the Mongol Empire and various khanates, later taken over by Russia and Lithuania. They were a people defined largely by freedom, and the word Cossack is believed to derive from the old Cuman-Turkic word for literally free man. They were a people of independence, nomadicity, and militarism, inheriting many traits from the people that surrounded them. Their home was the wide open steppe, where the only real law was that of a man's household. Assorted Russian Tsars soon set their sights on this vast land because it was basically free, but they quickly realized how utterly fucking impossible it would be to actually tame the place themselves. So they struck deals with the Cossacks, many of whom were Slavs themselves. In exchange for helping control and secure Russia's new lands, they were given a blank check to do basically whatever the fuck they wanted. So they went in all directions, building little towns and forts and establishing a presence across Russia's frontiers. The Cossacks that found themselves on the incredibly fertile soil of the banks of the Dnieper, meanwhile, were far more sedentary than their relatives out east, finding service with Lithuania and eventually the Commonwealth, and later establishing their own state, known as the Zaporozhian Sich. Ukrainian Cossacks formed a much more traditional society than the Russian ones did, being generally Western educated and having their own nobility, traditions, and even maintaining a form of parliamentary democracy. As you may know, the Commonwealth got murdered by its neighbors, and the Ukrainian Cossacks naturally also found themselves within the borders of the Russian Empire. Zaporozhia would be forcibly disbanded and its members were relocated, but overall they enjoyed extreme privileges in comparison to basically all other groups of people, which included not needing to pay taxes on lands, the right to near total self-government in the regions they settled, and special ranks amongst the military and nobility in exchange for their loyalty and military service. As a result, the Cossacks were some of the empire's most loyal subjects, serving faithfully for centuries. The Cossacks would be organized into hosts, essentially an army group with territory that it was allowed to nominally govern and recruit from. The Ukrainian Cossacks would form the backbone of the Kuban host, as well as multiple others further to the west, while the Russians made up the majority of the rest. The main exception was that of the Don host, which was far and away the largest and was pretty ethnically diverse with large populations of both Ukrainians and Russians. Because of their unique origins, the Ukrainian Cossacks maintained many of their traditions as they shuffled around, and several major noble families would emerge from the Cossack ranks. One such family was the House of Skoropadsky. Now, the Skoropadsky family can trace its origins back centuries to the aristocrats of the Zaporozhian Sich, with one notable member, Ivan, even becoming hetman in the early 1700s. Oh, Hetman is the title conferred to a Cossack leader, with Ataman being the Russian equivalent. Semantics. Anyways, Ivan had a brother who had a kid, and his kid had kids, one of which was Petro Skoropadsky. The family owned a sizable estate in the village of Trostyanets, near Chernihiv, not to be confused with the city of identical name near Sumy, or the similarly named Trostyanka, also near Chernihiv. Yes, this genuinely confused me, and yes, I am tired. This estate was big. As members of the nobility, they had plenty of wealth and influence. They held land across Ukraine, and the Skoropadskys were fans of hosting many notable people. They also did a lot of farming because, of course, being nobles, they naturally also spent plenty of time abroad in Europe. It was on one such trip where Petro's son, Pavlo Petrovich, would be born. He popped into existence in Wiesbaden, of all places, on May 15th of 1873. He lived here with his grandparents, who were living in Germany at that point until he was 5. The main thing of note that occurred here was his learning to speak German, which will be shockingly important for later. Let's just say this won't be the last time he was in Germany. After his arrival in his true homeland, he was treated to the full noble experience. His parents made damn sure to imprint a strong Ukrainian Cossack identity onto the little guy, made easier by the veritable fucking cultural center that his house was. Since military service was mandatory for male members of Cossack families, and the Skoropadskys had a long martial tradition, he was basically born and bred to be a soldier. He would attend the gymnasium in Starodub, a town roughly between Gomel and Bryansk, where he would do pretty good in his classes overall. This is also where he would be immersed in Russian culture and customs, which, along with his Ukrainian upbringing, would influence him greatly. His military education would begin in 1886, attending the prestigious Page Corps in St. Petersburg. This was an officer academy dedicated exclusively to training the sons of nobles and aristocratic families. Can't have the cringe dirt people without rich parents messing up your nice academies after all. He naturally received his education primarily in cavalry-related things because, he's a fucking Cossack. He would complete his studies in 1893, being posted to the Imperial Guard Cavalry and serving as a squad commander. He would rise the ranks quickly, making lieutenant by 1897 and captain of the guard by 1901. He would also get married in 1898 to a fellow Ukrainian noble who was the daughter of a bigwig general. The couple had 6 children, all except one, living fairly long and fulfilling lives. When his father died, he would also inherit his massive network of property, making Pavlo Petrovich fabulously wealthy in a time where not many people were. He would remain in the military in some capacity until the Russian Empire ceased to exist, making his military heritage proud. Of course, though, Russia was at peace for most of this, giving him dick fucking all to do other than, shoot protesters or something. If only there was an Asian expansionist empire that had a habit of sneak attacking people's boats to go fight for the glory of the Tsar. Hey, would you look at that? Skoropadsky's first major conflict would be the Russo-Japanese War. This war shows up a lot if you couldn't tell. It's kind of a canon event. He reacted to the news of the war declaration by basically going, "Finally, holy shit, took you long enough," and he submitted a request to get reassigned to somewhere actually relevant. As a Cossack, he naturally was reassigned to a Cossack formation, specifically to the 3rd Verkhnudinsk Cavalry Regiment under the supervision of the Transbaikal host. In May, he was promoted again to aide-de-camp to General Keller, who promptly fucking died, so he went and took command of a section of the Cossack regiment instead. He proved a brave and incredibly skilled military leader for the duration of the conflict, being showered with awards and recognition. As you may know, despite Skoropadsky being good at his job, Russia got its ass beat, and no amount of individual heroism could save the Russian army from being the Russian army. As the empire nearly exploded, see the Savinkov video, Skoropadsky would continue his upward trend, being made the direct aide to Tsar Nicholas himself in December of 1905. For the next few years, he would basically be the Tsar's bodyguard and source of sober second thought. He continued his military service in the Guards Cav and kinda just climbed the ladder, being made commander of a Finnish Dragoon regiment in 1910, and then being promoted to Major General in the Life Guards in 1912. Pavlo Petrovich himself is a fascinating character personality-wise. He was very much torn between two identities. He was a Ukrainian Cossack, born to Ukrainian nobility and raised in an environment that held a reverence for Ukrainian culture and identity. That said, he attended a Russian school and a Russian military academy where all of the professors were Russians and had very little love for the minorities of the empire. Furthermore, as a big-shot noble, he constantly brushed shoulders with many notable Russian aristocrats who were particularly chauvinistic, which included the Tsar himself. Oh, and he was a Cossack who, as we have established, were generally some of the Tsar's strongest henchmen, so much of his own social class was predominantly pro-Russian. For his whole life, he had to balance these two identities that had been imprinted upon him, and this would come to have great influence on his ability to govern later. He generally came to regard Russia and Ukraine as two parts of a whole, so to speak, and did not necessarily believe in Ukrainian independence. However, he did believe that Ukraine should be raised to a more equal status within the empire, and the two peoples should govern as equals rather than maintain the complete Russian domination that existed up to this point. He basically would have gone as far as home rule for Ukraine, but not total separation. He did also want Ukrainian culture promoted within the framework of this equal Russian federal state. He was not very good at verbalizing this, and later down the line he will be opposed by Ukrainian nationalists who believed him a Russian puppet, and hardline Russian reactionaries who saw him as a Ukrainian radical separatist. Ouch. Truly the plight of the enlightened centrist. His position as a landowner also made him a pretty conservative monarchist, because generally when you have fuck you money, you want to maintain the system that gave it to you. Those damn kids, am I right? poisoned by newfangled ideologies and technologies, all these liberals and socialists running around, people believing in nationalism, and honestly, it seems like all you see these days is violence in movies and sex on TV. We need to return to those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely. Other than all this, he was a generally pretty chill dude. Calm but authoritative, carried himself like an officer and a gentleman, the kind of guy that etiquette classes and being around the fucking Tsar produces. As with all people, he was complex, but above everything else, he was a soldier. When the big kerfuffle broke out in 1914, Skoropadsky was one of the first to arrive on the front lines because, as a Cossack, he just couldn't resist a good kerumpin. Now, commander of an entire regiment, he saw combat in several places, notably in East Prussia, where he would not get fucking annihilated like Samsonov's army. By the end of 1914, he was in command of the Combined Cavalry Division, and through the next couple years, he would be moved around to various cavalry formations as he was needed. This would culminate in his promotion to Lieutenant General on January 1st of 1916. His final posting of note would come in January of 1917, being placed in command of the 34th Army Corps, stationed in his homeland. And it is here where shit actually starts to happen. 1917 was kind of a shit show if you didn't know. February Revolution occurs and all hell breaks loose. With the bans and censorship applied to national minorities and most political organizations no longer in effect, everyone started getting some ideas. Of course, Ukraine was not exempt from this. Being a land of farmers and peasants, socialist and democratic ideas had taken root for the most part. In March of 1917, a council of sorts was called in Kiev, leading to the establishment of the Central Rada of Ukraine, led by the first technical leader of a Ukrainian state, Mikhail. This government would be composed mainly of various Ukrainian socialist and nationalist liberal groups, as well as the Ukrainian branch of the SRs. Initially, the Central Rada did not advocate outright independence, rather attempting to establish total home rule within the Russian Republic by creating a constituent assembly. It would also move to establish a Ukrainian national army separate from the Russian military proper. The easiest comparison that can be made, I think, would be to the dominions of the British Empire, if that makes sense. Obviously, this greatly antagonized those in Petrograd, who were, don't forget, all Russians, but realistically, what the fuck were they going to do about it? The National Army would be established in May, and seeing the writing on the wall, the bigwigs relented. Anything to keep the Ukrainians in the fight. As a part of this, the now Commander-in-Chief, Vladimir Kornilov, would order the Ukrainization of a portion of the Russian military, with Skoropadsky's army having the honor of becoming the first all-Ukrainian military formation, transforming into the first Ukrainian Corps. This, in turn, led to the Central Rada being recognized as the legitimate government of the territory of Ukraine with a few caveats, and in essence, the country was granted home rule. This, in turn, led them to actually support Kerensky's government during Kornilov's attempted putsch. Skoropadsky, despite being a monarchist, went along with all of this because at least it kept the fucking commies at bay for a while. In general, the Rada had pretty overwhelming support amongst the Ukrainian population, especially among the soldiers and peasants. Hrushevsky also made efforts to achieve some degree of ethnic harmony within the country and succeeded in achieving the support of the Poles, Jews, and even the Russians. Ukrainian culture also saw a bit of a renaissance, brief though it may have been. While not independent, genuine progress, both socially and economically, was being made. That said, it wasn't all sunflowers and cornfields. The Rada as a government remained shaky and struggled to actually assert itself and deliver on many of its promises, especially those related to land reforms and the war. It was staffed with idealists and dreamers, and not a whole lot of people who actually knew what the fuck they were doing. And since Petrograd insisted on staying in the fight, Ukraine was obligated to follow, and many, especially those in more radical camps, were beginning to believe that the Rada had strapped itself to a sinking ship, which it kinda had. The peasants got restless and they started turning to the regional Soviets, as the Bolsheviks were increasingly convincing. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do, nor what they would bring upon their nation. Had the Russian Republic survived, though, it is likely that this version of Ukraine would have as well, regardless of agitation. Surely nothing could fuck that up, right? October comes around and the country explodes again. The Rada, in response, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Bolshevik government and promptly jumped into the unknown by declaring Ukrainian independence as the Ukrainian National Republic. The Reds didn't immediately invade Ukraine, and the two parties kind of just had the world's most awkward coffee date in Kiev. They did attempt 3 separate coups in 2 months, though. The Rada also took this time to claim a big chunk of territory that had large Ukrainian populations, matching up pretty closely to the funny Kaiserreich borders that we all know and love, as well as the Kuban. The Rada had signed an agreement with the Kuban Cossacks, which, along with the Don and Terek hosts, had recently revolted against the Reds to join with the volunteer army. This agreement essentially made the Kuban a protectorate of Ukraine, although this was nigh impossible to enforce in the chaos of everything. everything. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Bolshevik leaders fucked off to Kharkiv, where they enjoyed more support among the industrial workers and the Russians in the east of the country, and proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic in December of 1917. So, the Reds in Russia went, hey, look, they do want us after all, ignore all of those other people, and sent a big fuck-off army to crush Ukraine and see her brought under the thumb of communism. Meanwhile, Skoropadsky is watching all of this unfold from the front lines going, oh, shit, oh god, oh fuck. He raced to Vinnytsia, then to Kiev in November with a rifle division to shatter another attempted Bolshevik military coup. Around this time, he was also elected hetman and military commander of the Ukrainian Free Cossacks, Cossacks without a host, basically, and they would serve as one of the most stalwart anti-Bolshevik factions at his command. However, the Central Rada decided to cause problems. They didn't like him for being an aristocrat and pro-Russian, so they went out of their way to fuck him over, so in December he resigned his position. Deprived of one of their most solid military leaders, and lacking a professional military force of their own, the Rada got kind of shit-canned when the Reds invaded in January. Multiple states revolted to join the Bolsheviks, and they made quick progress towards Kiev. There were multiple skirmishes, the most notable of which occurred at Guthier at the end of January. In a heroic stand made by students, cadets, and Cossacks against forces that outnumbered them severely, the Red advance was delayed by several days, giving the Rada time to evacuate Kiev. In response to this, the Bolsheviks executed 26 POWs, mostly literal teenagers that they had captured. They ended up taking Kiev regardless, and it looked like Ukraine was about to be subjugated once again. But, of course, they had an ace up their sleeve. You see, Ukraine had signed a treaty with the Central Powers. Peace and a shitload of grain in exchange for German protection and recognition. So, seeing the Reds pushing into their new breadbasket, the Germans leapt into action. They were intent on enforcing the treaty, Russians be damned, and thus, along with Austria, smashed 53 divisions into the western portions of the former Russian Empire in Operation Faustschlag. This enabled the Ukrainians to counterattack as well, and facing basically zero Russian resistance, the entire country was free of Bolsheviks by the end of March. Germans don't fuck around. However, when they got to Kiev, they altered the deal. The grain must flow or Germany loses the war, so they decided to secure their investment further. On April 29th, they backed a coup of their own, using Ukrainian conservative factions as their point men who dissolved the Rada and arrested basically the entire government. Of course, they needed a strong leader to rally the nation and not piss off the Germans. Someone strong-willed who ideally had military experience and connections among the aristocracy. I wonder who it could be. You ever just get shanghaied into running a country that you didn't even really want to exist in the first place? Well, Skoropadsky certainly was. He had helped found a Ukrainian political organization that had held an event on the 29th, which sparked protests and rallies against the Central Rada. Skoropadsky had accepted the proposal to topple the government by this point, and seeing an opportunity, he made his way to the location of these protests. He was quote-unquote elected by popular force and his supporters getting rowdy, and promptly marched on the main government buildings facing basically no resistance. The Germans had already arrested most of the important people a few days prior, so there was nobody to challenge him. He was declared the Hetman of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian state was established. Unfortunately for him, he was immediately dealt possibly the worst hand imaginable. The Germans were on his ass from day one, and there was an omnipresent garrison that essentially confirmed the country as a puppet state, reducing his influence over the population dramatically. This German garrison had a habit of enforcing its own law of the land, and they did a whole lot of oppressing of their own. Oh yeah, and there were near-constant peasant revolts and workers' strikes from day one. Calling the Ukrainian state a state would honestly be pushing it a little. All that said, he still tried his best. His first few actions revolved around cementing power and reversing many socialist reforms undertaken by the previous government. The new state was a monarchy in all but name, with Skoropadsky having basically absolute power in practice, until he could convene a new session of parliament after the situation had stabilized. In his ideal world, Ukraine was a monarchy with a parliament similar to the late-stage Russian Empire. The hetman had the ability to pass and veto legislation, make all cabinet appointments, and held the title of commander-in-chief of both the army and navy. However, despite his power, the all-seeing germ was still there. They had the real power exerted out of the barrel of their guns. Their attempts to enforce the export of agricultural products to Germany naturally led to conflict and often bloodshed. Starting in May, he moved on to reforming the place into something functional, focusing on the bureaucracy, land reforms, education, and the military. Bureaucratic reforms were simple enough. Fire every dumbass idealist associated with the Rada and replace them with people who actually knew what the fuck they were doing. Despite his Russophile views, he also wasn't stupid and did attempt to give his regime a Ukrainian character. Keyword is attempt. Most Ukrainian parties wanted nothing to do with him because they were all socialist Democrats, and many of the landowners were Russophiles who didn't like the idea of a free Ukraine. But he did eventually succeed in establishing a functional government that the Germans were okay with. His government would be much more effective and capable than the previous one, but that wasn't saying a whole lot. He took to shoving through some reforms, notably various laws that restored and protected the property rights and individual freedoms of the people of Ukraine. This didn't do enough to calm tensions though, and in some cases made them worse, as landowners forcibly expropriated lands given to peasants during the previous administration. This leads us into the land reform issue. The intended goal was to boost up a conservative middle class of peasant landowners by using the state to gradually acquire and redistribute land amongst them in such a way that would balance the demands of both sides. There were also plans to impose limits on the amount of land someone could own, and a series of other agrarian policies were meant to be implemented. Unfortunately, the Hetman was far too slow in this regard and had a lot of other problems to deal with, and by the time the reforms actually began to be implemented, the German Empire was on the verge of collapse, and his regime would go with it. Conflict over land between landowners and peasants would, as a result, severely destabilize the country. Skoropadsky also attempted to reform the Ukrainian education system. The main goal here, ironically, was Ukrainization. Over 150 new gymnasiums and hundreds more primary schools were opened in the year of 1918, and considerable expense was spared to offer courses in Ukrainian language and culture to all teachers in the nation. Multiple Ukrainian universities were established, Russian universities in the east began to offer Ukrainian classes for those so inclined, millions of textbooks in Ukrainian would be printed, and dozens of cultural institutions were established across the country. He also had a role in founding the Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences, the main scientific institution in the country to this day. This made the Russians mad, as most of them didn't really see the Ukrainians as their own people, driving a wedge between Skoropadsky and one of his only consistent support bases. That said, this was still arguably his most important undertaking during his reign. His actions directly led to a Ukrainian cultural resurgence, building a solid foundation for the Ukrainians of the future to build on. He deserves a shitload of credit for that, if nothing else. Finally, being a military man, he also focused heavily on the army. It was in a rather shit state since nearly the entire army had been disbanded after the coup, so he had to build it from the ground up. He wanted to reform it along German lines, believing that Ukraine would need a strong military to not immediately fucking die, which, fair enough. A general staff was set up, conscription was introduced, the Germans gave Ukraine the former Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Cossacks were granted new special status, and Skoropadsky oversaw many reforms to military organization, command, and supply. Overall, while not complete by the end of his reign, these reforms were reasonably effective, and the Ukrainian military was on the path to becoming a solid fighting force capable of defending itself. All taken together, Skoropadsky had created one of the countries of all time. It was kinda stable, the economy didn't completely collapse, and people weren't brawling in the streets for a while. One can definitely make snap judgments about his policies, but his little polity did not last long enough for any of them to truly come to fruition fully. As we have established, the general population did not like him all that much, even less so after he appointed a shitload of Russians to provincial positions. Skoropadsky's main goal was ostensibly the re-establishment of a Russian state that included Ukraine, although with the two on more equal footing. This only further served to make the Ukrainians upset, as nationalistic fervor had swept the land by this point, and they weren't willing to go back to the same old status quo. By June, outright insurgency had broken out by half a dozen different groups across the country, all seeking to overthrow the Hetman. Numerous campaigns by the Germans, Austrians, and Hetmanist forces saw widespread death and destruction, especially amongst the rural population, only further worsening the situation. None of this was helped by the Central Powers continuing to requisition food products, causing many farmers to protest by refusing to work their fields, their ranks quickly bolstered by factory and rail workers also going on strike. This culminated in two events at the end of July. Field Marshal Hermann von Eichhorn, the German military governor of Ukraine, got fucking assassinated by a member of the SRs, old habits die hard, and the Ukrainian National Union was established by a broad coalition of center-left and nationalist Democrats, along with many key economic and cultural figures in Ukraine. This group dedicated itself to achieving a free and democratic Ukraine, bringing a shitload of influence to bear on the Hetman. Through October and November, Skoropadsky attempted to negotiate and reorient his cabinet to be more Ukrainian, but it was far too late. Germany was collapsing, the Bolsheviks were propagandizing and preparing for round two, with many German soldiers actually being willing to back a pro-Soviet coup, and the National Union was preparing an uprising. On November 13th, 2 days after the end of World War I, they established the Directory, a council that would serve as a provisional government, notably staffed by both Vinichenko and Petliura. They issued some simple demands. Skoropadsky needs to resign, Russian officers need to fuck off back to Russia, and the Ukrainian National Republic needs to be re-established. On the 17th, they marched on Kiev. Most of the army would defect to them. There was a month-long standoff as they took over most of the country, and by mid-December, the Hetman's government had been toppled. Skoropadsky formally abdicated power on December 14th before disguising himself as a German soldier and heading west with their retreating forces, never to return to his homeland. We will talk more about what happened in Ukraine after 1918 in future videos. His chosen destination was a familiar one: Germany. He already spoke the language, and they had been propping up his regime, so it made sense. He would eventually set up shop in Wannsee near Berlin. His years in exile saw him become the center point of the new Hetmanist movement, a political movement of Ukrainian emigres that sought to establish a Ukrainian monarchy centered around the deposed Hetman and eventually his son. In 1920, the Ukrainian Union of Farmers and Statesmen, or USHD, was founded by several of these emigres. Skoropadsky would serve as their big cheese for most of its existence. He was doing fuck all else anyway, so might as well have some fun, you know. He did a pretty good job at guiding the movement, establishing branches in many Western countries with large Ukrainian populations, and putting effort into promoting Ukrainian culture abroad. However, the movement never really got off the ground, and he was unable to effectively rally the bulk of the emigre community. Monarchism was definitely out of fashion, and his particular brand struggled to gain momentum, partly due to his prior failures to hold Ukraine together. After the Nazis came to power, things naturally got a little bit tense. He did not like them, not by a fucking long shot, but the fact that he was living in their country and didn't want to be sent to a concentration camp like many Ukrainian nationalists would be meant that he needed to pretend to be cordial and smile for the cameras and all that. He repeatedly told them to go fuck themselves when it came to open collaboration and did his best to defend his people's interests whenever he could. He would also exile a portion of his family, this time to the UK, to keep them safe in the event of an apocalyptic war. Said apocalyptic war came, and he found himself still stuck in Germany, unable to really leave or do all that much. Many Ukrainian emigres would back the Nazis, mistakenly believing that their promise to establish a free Ukraine wasn't complete horseshit, but Skoropadsky and the Hetmanists would not be among them. He almost made it. Almost. On April 16th of 1945, he was in Plattling in Bavaria when the rail station he was in was struck in an Allied bombing raid. He would be wounded in the process. He fought on for 10 more days before succumbing to his injuries on April 26th at the age of 71. He was buried in the city of Oberstdorf, where he remains to this day. As with all humans, Skoropadsky maintains a complicated legacy. Funny, I had a professor who said that historians are very fun at parties because whenever they get asked a question, the only answer they should be giving is, "It depends," or "It's complicated." So, yeah, he's complicated. Many of those that existed alongside him, especially in Ukrainian nationalist circles, didn't care much for the guy. They saw him as an authoritarian asshole at best and a Russian stooge who didn't care for the people of Ukraine at absolute worst. His willingness to work with the Germans and the White Army painted him as a hypocrite, and his general beliefs regarding both the Russians and democracy as a whole didn't exactly help matters. That all said, others would argue that Ukraine under Skoropadsky was on the path to becoming a stable and functioning society, with even some saner white generals like Wrangel admitting that he was actually doing okay despite the unbelievably shitty hand that he had been dealt. He made genuine strides towards the cementing of a Ukrainian national identity, and as a result, more contemporary interpretations have painted him as an almost tragic hero of Ukrainian independence. He undoubtedly paved the way for the Ukrainian people, and as a result, he is actually remembered quite fondly in the modern Ukrainian state, with several streets named after him and a commemorative coin minted in 2023 with his likeness on it. As for his family, they ended up in many places, one of which being Toronto, which is really funny, and continue, to this day actually, to claim the title of Hetman of Ukraine. The Hetmanist movement did largely die out, however. So, in conclusion, Volodymyr Zelensky should adopt the title of Hetman. I think that would be based. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.